Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of February of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, we're going to start with the south of Ukraine. But before we start, I would like to say that today, or the previous 24 hours, according to the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, I believe was the worst 24 hours since, I don't know, December or November of the previous year. According to the numbers that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation provided, they're saying that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around half a thousand soldiers during these 24 hours. So as you can see, their losses are very high, but I believe that we can multiply these losses maybe in two times, at least in two times, because I believe that these numbers don't include the losses from Bakhmut and many other places or something like this. So let's start from the south. When talking about Kherson area, the Russians continued their artillery duels in this area, and as a result of artillery duels during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around two artillery systems. One Akatsa that located in the vicinity of Kherson, and another D-30 that located on the north. So exactly at those places where the Ukrainians made attempts to cross Dnipro River. So as a support artillery system, that main job was to protect and to cover the Ukrainian forces who were trying to cross the Dnipro River. When talking about Zaporozhye area or western Zaporozhian front line, the Russians are saying that as a result of artillery duels during the previous 24 hours, they managed to destroy another D-30 howitzer in the vicinity of Gulyai-Polye, and also the Russians attacked the 110th Brigade in the vicinity of Novodarivka. Now let's talk about Ugledar. Ugledar is there are a lot of opposite updates that are coming from the front lines, from the Western sources and the Russian sources. But the thing is that something interesting is going to happen there, I believe, that during the next week. When talking about the Russians, they're providing a lot of information. They're saying that there are still heavy clashes in the vicinity of Ugledar. And as I understand right now, the Russians managed to establish some local temporary bridgehead in the vicinity of this town, in the residential area that located on the southeast of Ugledar. Maybe they managed to establish more fortifications, checkpoints in these brushes, in these forest lines, and so on. And during the previous days, the Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russians and to force them to step back, to encircle them, and so on. And the Russian Ministry of Defense reported that during the previous 24 hours in the vicinity, or to be more precise, on South Donetsk and Zaporozhye area, the Ukrainians lost around 130 soldiers. Mainly the losses were among 72nd Brigade and 110th Brigade that located in the vicinity of Novodarivka. Also, the Russians destroyed around 7 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems, one Gvozdika, one D-30 howitzer, and another D-20 howitzer. Also, the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians stopped any offensive operation. They cancel any possible plan of counter-offensive operation or offensive operation in the vicinity of Krivina or Svatova. They changed their plans regarding Bakhmut, Seversk, and so on with one purpose: to move reserves in direction of Ugledar. The Russians are saying that during the previous week or previous days, the Ukrainians redeployed around 1,500 soldiers in the vicinity of Ugledar, and they're moving their soldiers through Bogoyavlenka into the south. Furthermore, the Ukrainian sources are saying that the Ukrainians started a mining process of the streets in Ugledar itself. So when they're doing mining process, maybe that means that Ukrainians are planning to step back, or they understand that the Russians within the next few days are planning to start another offensive operation in this area, and they will try to push forces from Ugledar. And of course, now the Ukrainians need to move as much as possible reserves, because they understand if Ugledar falls, that means that Velika Novoselovka is going to fall, Kurakhov is going to fall, all these towns, all these bridgehead, entire bridgehead will fall. I believe they understand this, so that is the reason they're moving as much as possible reserves in the vicinity of Ugledar. Very interesting, so we'll follow this situation. I believe that the next week is going to be the most important, that will determine the situation on Ugledar and will determine the Russian progress in the south. When talking about in perspective of greatest Russian offensive operation. When talking about Mariinka, there are still no progress in this area. The Russians, there are still heavy clashes in the western part of Mariinka. The Ukrainians do have possibility to move reserves, endless reserves, and endless support of this area. So that this is the reason why there is no progress, and I believe that maybe the Russians decided to change their plans regarding Mariinka. The most important area they need to take control over is Pobeda, this small village. So the entire Mariinka is not so important for the Russians. The most important is Pobeda and the hills that located in the around this town, and of course Ugledar. So maybe the Russians took a decision to stop here because they achieved the necessary progress. They cut the road, they cut support line between Krasnogorovka, Kurakhova, Mariinka, and let's say Konstantinovka. They cut this supply road, and now they're thinking how to take control of Pobeda. So we'll see. When talking about Donetsk front line starts, let's say, at Mariinka and ends somewhere in Siversk. It's the biggest front line. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 115 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems, D-20 and D-30 howitzer. The Russians were attacking 110th Brigade, 35th Brigade, 36th Brigade, and 118th Brigade, the towns like Sporne, Avdiivka, and Krasnogorovka. So the Russians pointed that during the previous 24 hours they were mainly concentrated in the area of Avdiivka. There is a town Krasnogorovka, another town Krasnogorovka is located on the west from Donetsk. So it is very difficult to understand which the Krasnogorovka the Russians were talking about, but because of the fact that the Russians announced about Avdiivka, I believe that they were concentrated in this area. Furthermore, they reported they destroyed the 20 howitzer in the same area, so that means that maybe the Russians are planning to activate some movements in this area, and they will try to develop their movements, their bridgehead in direction of Kamyanka, that located on the west from this bridgehead from Krutaya Balka and so on. Furthermore, they will try to develop their movements in direction of Krasnogorovka itself, that located on the northwest of Avdiivka. And the most important, the Russians will try to develop their offensive operation from Peski bridgehead in direction of Severnaya Tonnika and Orlovka. Maybe they will try to do this, and the reason is to push the Ukrainian artillery systems from this area as far as possible. That will reduce the Ukrainian possibilities to attack Donetsk and so on. Now let's move to Torets, Konstantinovka. There are no changes in this area. The only update from this area is that the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours, if you know, maybe you saw Zelensky within a few days ago, during some kind of interview, he reported that the Ukrainians are not planning to give up and to step back from Bakhmut. That Ukrainians are, according to his words, are planning to fight for this town till the last Ukrainian. And that was his words, but when talking about the facts, we know that Ukrainians are moving more and more reserves on the line between Fyodorovka and Chasov Yar, this line. And one of such a group of reserves were deployed in the vicinity in the town Drushkovka. This town is located somewhere in the middle between Slavyansk and Konstantinovka. Just from, I believe so, from logistic perspective, they decided to deploy this brigade somewhere in the middle, just to be the shorthand between these two towns and to have possibilities to move reserves very fast without problems. So the Russians, I believe, spotted those forces and they attack, and as a result of that attack, the Ukrainian lost hundreds of soldiers. It's very difficult to provide the real number of Ukrainian losses in this area. But as a fact, and furthermore, the number of losses in this town wasn't included in the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. When talking about Bakhmut itself, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the area between towns Stupochki and Ivanovska to cut this road TO 504 and to cut supply and support and to cut any connection with Bakhmut with the mainland. When talking about the south, the Russian source map has been updated a little bit. As you can see, now the Russians are showing some another progress in this area. They added more territories under Russian control. When talking about the eastern part of Bakhmut, the Russians continue pushing. They entered, as we discussed, this small block in Bakhmut itself. When talking about Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovyevka, the Ukrainians still hold this area, these two blocks, these two towns, or the number of towns still remains under Ukrainian control. But I believe that you saw videos and photos of Ukrainians who were stepping back from this area. Yesterday, the Russians published Russian sources and Ukrainian sources published another video how the Ukrainians left the vicinity of Paraskovyevka, Krasnaya Gora, this area. They are saying that they were thankful to God, and they were saying that they survived in this hell, and they were moving in direction of, let's say, Slaviansk. I'm not sure about the destiny of those guys, but anyway, I believe that is true about their words about the fact that there is a hell in these towns. When talking about the Ukrainians sources in the Western, they're saying that the 28th of January was the highest pressure. The Russians, Wagner's to be more precise, was like the highest pressure on the Bakhmut and the towns around Bakhmut. But also, when talking about today, the Western sources confirms that I believe that Wagner started another wave of storm operation of Bakhmut. They're saying that they haven't seen such a pressure in the vicinity of Bakhmut since the beginning of a special military operation. So I believe that the Russians, or to be more precise, Wagner started the final push. And we can understand Wagner's because there is timings. Everything is according to timings. The Russians need to take Bakhmut, and they need to collapse, destroy the Ukrainian garrison in this area, and this will allow the Russians army to start offensive operation from the north and from the south. As we discussed, the Russians are not going and are not planning to start any offensive operation before Bakhmut falls, or at least before Bakhmut appears in operational encirclement, when some number of Ukrainian forces will be encircled without any possibilities to get out of this town. When talking about let's say Mykolaievka, Sakov and Seti front line, this one, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours the Ukrainians made few attempts to make some kind of counter-offensive operation, but all those attempts were repulsed and the Ukrainians were defeated, and the Russians continue moving in direction of the north, in direction of Siversk, to encircle this town. A lot of icons, as you can see, we may find in the vicinity on the Liman front line. The Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainian losses were around 120 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. As you can see, another day in a row with a very heavy losses from the Ukrainian side on this front line. The Russians are saying that they were attacking 25th Brigade, 71st Brigade, 95th Brigade, and 27th Battalion in the vicinity of towns Novosadova, Yampolovka. This is Yampolovka, Stelmachovka. This town is located on the north of this front line, Dibrova. This is our Dibrova, Serebryan, and forest in Serebryanka, this forest. Furthermore, some Russian soldiers, officers on the ground, or maybe some kind of press on the ground, reported that the Russians, let's call it got as close as possible to the town by the name of Tarskoye. So maybe even these minutes, these hours, the Russians entered some buildings on that located on the outskirts of this town. So we can say, according to the Russian sources, that today the Russians entered the vicinity of Tarskoye, this small village that located on the east from Zarechne. So by attack from Kremenaya, so they're somewhere here. So the Russians are somewhere here. I can't tell exactly about where exactly the Russians located, but they are somewhere there. And this is the Russian plan to establish a temporary front line along the Zhiribets River, that this will allow the Russians to complete their regrouping and to attack in direction of Yampolovka, from Yampolovka in direction of Zakitne, Platonovka. It will allow them to establish a bridgehead in this area, or at least to cut any movements of the Ukrainians that you can use the roads between Seversk-Zakitne and Seversk-Kaleniki. So the only roads that Ukrainians have to supply and support, or to be more precise, to evacuate from this front line. When talking about the north part, from about the Kupiansk front line, as you can see, there are also a lot of icons in this area. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours they managed to spot and destroy around 6 commandos groups. When talking about Dvurechne, the Russians reported, if you remember yesterday, they said that they entered the outskirts of this town, and today we received the report that the Russians captured the railroad station. And when talking about the Western sources map, there are a number of towns in this area: Dvurechne, Tavlazhanka, Gorbivka, Gryanivka. When talking about this area, now the Russians are saying that they controls or established 100% control, or had before this offensive operation control over Gorbivka, Tavlazhanka. Now the Russians control more than 50% of Dvurechne. They control the western, north part and railroad station. There is, I believe, just the southeast part is still Ukrainians. Not even Ukrainians control this area, because the Russians are saying that Gryaninkovka, this town, is in the gray zone. So I believe that Gryaninkovka and the south area of Dvurechne is also in the gray zone. And I believe that we can start counting days before the Russians enter this town, establish some checkpoint, and will force the Ukrainians to leave this bank of the river. And after that, the Russians will start movement in direction of Kupiansk, because Kupiansk is the vital area, focal point in this offensive operation. And I believe that this is the plan of the Russians, to establish the front line along Oskol River, the entire front line. Because, as we discussed many times, if the Russians want to take control over Slaviansk and Kramatorsk, highly unlikely they will do this, like to attack these towns in front. To do this, they need to attack these towns from many sides, and for these purposes they need to return back control over Izum, Svetogor, Liman, and to try to encircle this area. Or if the Russians are not able to return back Izum, they need to penetrate the Ukrainian defense order somewhere in New York Toretsk agglomeration, and to start movement from the south. Anyway, they need to attack this area from many directions, as many as possible. If they are able to attack from 3 directions, like from Bakhmut, from, let's say, Izum, and let's say from New York Toretsk agglomeration, the best solution for the Russians. But for now, I can't tell you if they are able to do this, because when talking about Bakhmut, yes, this direction is most obvious, because the Russians have almost completed the battle for Bakhmut. When talking about Izum and direction from Liman, Izum, the Russians have just started these movements, and I believe that they need at least a month to get the outskirts of Svetogorsk or Izum to reach this area. And when talking about the south direction, let's say from Toretsk, New York agglomeration, or from Avdiivka, from this one, the Russians haven't started doing anything in this direction. So that means that maybe we won't even see any movements in this area. Furthermore, when talking about Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, we understand what the Russians are planning to do. This is the heart of Donbas occupation. This is the most fortified areas. Everything in Ukraine started from these 2 towns, and these towns were taken by the Ukrainians during the campaign of 2014 or so on. But to tell the truth, I don't understand how we can add Ugledar to this picture and to this operation. I believe that when talking about Ugledar, Velika Novoselovka, Zaporozhye, the Russians have another plan, another objectives, another it's completely, I believe, different army with different goals. So these two armies, I believe, works completely separately. They don't have common even goals. These guys need to take that located on the north and central part to take control over Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. So let's say when talking about the Russians, to liberate DPR region. But when talking about Ugledar, I believe they have completely different goals, and this is a very interesting, important area. The only thing that comes to my mind is that when talking about the Russian parliament, there is a big picture of big map of Russian Federation and the entrance hall of this building. And according to that map, Zaporozhye and Kherson is a part of Russian Federation, because we remember about those referendums. So maybe the Russians are planning to do something with Zaporozhye, and to do this they need to take Ugledar, Velika Novoselovka, and then as a wave to cover Gulay Pole and Orekhov. Who knows? And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.